She didn't ring the bell. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps, with rain running off her coat in sheets, and she looked up at the lit window of the ranch house like it owed her something, though she couldn't have said what. The Alberta wind had been at her since Pincher Creek, and her boots had given out somewhere past the second cattle guard, and still she stood there a long moment before she finally climbed the steps and knocked. Imogen Calhoun had buried her husband 11 months earlier, and the grief had not softened into anything manageable. It had simply rearranged itself into a kind of stubbornness, a refusal to be turned away by weather or distance or the reputation of the man she'd come to work for. She'd heard the stories in town, at the feed store, from the Hendry sisters who ran the boarding house, that Desmond Wakefield went through Housekeepers the way other men went through boot leather, that he hadn't smiled since his wife left him standing at the altar of Saint. 8 and 6 years back that the ranch hands called him the frost behind his back because nothing warmed him, not whiskey, not Christmas, not the foals born each spring. She knocked again. The door opened on a man taller than she'd expected, with a jaw set so hard it looked carved, and eyes the color of a sky before snow. "You're late," he said. "I walked the last 4 miles, Imogen answered. "I'd say I made good time, all things considered." He looked at her for a long moment, at the mud on her hem, the case in her hand, the way she didn't flinch under his stare the way the others always had. Something crossed his face, brief as a cloud shadow, and was gone. "Kitchen's through there," he said, and turned, and that was the whole of her welcome. She'd answered the advertisement out of necessity more than ambition. The farm she and her husband Thomas had built outside Medicine Hat had gone to the bank within 4 months of his death. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though Imogen privately believed it was simply that some men weren't built to outlive their plans. She had no children, no family left in the province worth troubling, and a housekeeper's wage at the Wakefield ranch was more than double what she'd have earned in town. So she'd written the letter, gotten the reply, 3 terse lines, no warmth in them, and packed what little she owned into a single case. She had not expected the ranch to be so large. 6,000 acres of grazing land running up against the foothills, a main house with 11 rooms, most of them shut up and silent, smelling of dust and old cedar. She had not expected, either, the particular quality of the silence that lived in that house. Not peaceful, but held. The way a held breath is not the same as calm. The first week, she learned the rhythms of the place from a ranch hand named Otis Brennan, who'd worked the Wakefield land for 19 years and had the unhurried manner of a man who'd seen every kind of trouble a ranch could produce and outlasted most of it. "Don't take it personal," he told her, leaning against the corral fence while she hung laundry in a wind that kept trying to take it back. "He's not unkind, he's just." Otis searched for the word. "Closed up, like a gate that's been left to rust shut. You could put your whole weight against it, and it still won't give. What happened to him?" Otis was quiet a moment. "Woman named Sorcha Vane. Left him at the church door with 300 guests watching, and never sent word why. That was the spring of 20. He hasn't been the same man since, and I knew him before. So I can tell you for certain there was a different man in there once." Imogen pinned the last shirt to the line and said nothing, but she thought about it that night, lying in the small room off the kitchen that had been given to her, listening to the house settle around her like something exhaling. The second housekeeper before Imogen, Otis, told her this too. In the unhurried way he told her everything, a little at a time, like a man rationing his own stories, had lasted 4 days. She'd rearranged the parlor furniture without asking. The one before that had lasted a single afternoon. She'd hummed while she worked, and Desmond Wakefield had come down from his study and told her, with perfect courtesy and absolute finality, that the position was no longer available. Imogen made no such mistakes. She did not rearrange anything. She did not hum. She moved through the house with the same quiet economy she'd learned, keeping her own farm running those last hard years. When Thomas's hands had started shaking too badly to hold a hammer, and she'd taken over the mending, the fencing, the small repairs that kept a place from falling in on itself. She cooked plain food and left it covered on the stove. She did not ask him questions. She did not offer opinions on the weather or the state of the cattle or anything at all, and after the first 2 weeks, she noticed that he had stopped flinching when she entered a room. It was a small thing. She doubted he noticed it himself. The first real conversation between them happened by accident, on a Tuesday in late October, when she found him in the kitchen at 11 at night, sitting at the table with a ledger open in front of him and a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. "You'll want that warmed," she said, before she could stop herself. It was the kind of thing she might have said to Thomas, automatic, unthinking. Desmond looked up as if she'd startled him out of some deep water. "I didn't hear you. I wasn't trying to be quiet. You were somewhere else." She took the cup before he could object and crossed to the stove. "The books? The herd counts off from what we ship to Calgary. Either someone's stealing from me, or I can't add. Which do you think it is?" He looked at her properly then, the way he hadn't looked at anyone in longer than he could say. "I think I haven't slept well in some time, and a man who hasn't slept makes mistakes with numbers. Then you ought to sleep," Imogen said, setting the warmed coffee in front of him, "and look at the books with morning eyes. Numbers don't get less wrong for being stared at past midnight. I learned that the hard way doing my husband's accounts." Something in his face changed, not softened exactly, but opened a crack the way a window opens an inch in winter, just enough to let a thread of outside air through. "Your husband. He passed last year." She said it plainly, the way she'd trained herself to say it, without the catch in her voice that used to come when the words were newer. "Pneumonia. We had the farm outside Medicine Hat 11 years. I'm sorry. So am I. It doesn't undo anything, the sorry, but I thank you for it all the same." She picked up the cold dish rag and wrung it out over the basin, giving her hands something to do. "You ought to go up. The numbers will keep till morning." He went, eventually, though he sat with the ledger another 20 minutes first, and Imogen washed the same 3 dishes twice, just to have a reason to stay in the kitchen with him a while longer, though she could not have said, that night, exactly why. Winter came down hard that year, the way it does in the foothills, arriving almost without warning in the second week of November, with a storm that buried the lower pasture under 4 feet of snow in a single night. The cattle had to be moved, the calving sheds reinforced, and for 3 days the whole ranch operated on the kind of grim, wordless urgency that leaves no room for anything but the next task. Imogen worked alongside the men more than a housekeeper strictly needed to, carrying coffee and bread out to the barns at dawn, helping Otis's wife Phoebe roll bandages for a hand who'd torn his palm open on barbed wire, sitting up 2 nights running with a sick newborn calf that the men had given up on and that she, stubbornly, had not. It was past 2 in the morning on the 3rd night when Desmond found her in the calving shed, wrapped in a horse blanket, the calf's head in her lap, both of them breathing in the same slow rhythm. "Otis said you'd be out here," he said, lowering himself onto the straw beside her without being asked, which was, she would think later, the first time he had ever simply joined her in anything. She wasn't going to make it through another hour on her own. "I figured I'd sit with her either way it went." He watched the calf's ribs rise and fall. Most people would have let her go. It's one calf. Most people didn't carry her mother in from the storm with their own hands, the way Otis did. He near broke his back doing it. Seemed a poor return on his effort to let her die for want of someone sitting up. She glanced sideways at him. "You think I'm foolish." "I think," Desmond said slowly, "that I haven't seen anyone fight that hard for something small in a long while. Most things on this ranch get decided by what's profitable." "You're not thinking about profit." "No," Imogen agreed. "I'm thinking about her." They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't ask to be filled, and somewhere near 3 the calf's breathing steadied and her ears began to twitch, and Desmond exhaled something that was almost a laugh, rusty with disuse. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected, and did not examine too closely why his approval mattered to her as much as it did. What grew between them after that grew the way things grow in that country, slowly, low to the ground, built for survival rather than show. He began seeking her out in the evenings, not for any particular reason he named, just to sit in the kitchen while she finished the last of the day's work, the ledger forgotten, talking about small things. The price of feed, a mare that was due to foal, a letter from his sister in Saskatoon that he read aloud in a voice that grew, by degrees, less guarded. He told her about Sorchavain on a night in December, unprompted, the words coming out of him, the way water finally comes when a pump that sat dry for years is primed again. He told her about standing at the front of St. Aidan's for 2 hours before anyone had the courage to tell him she wasn't coming, about the long ride home alone in his wedding clothes, about the particular silence of the ranch house after that, a silence he'd built around himself on purpose, because it seemed safer than the alternative. "I don't tell people that," he said when he'd finished. Otis knows the shape of it. Nobody knows the whole thing. I won't repeat it, Imogen said. I know you won't. He said it with such simple certainty that it settled something in her chest she hadn't known was unsettled. That's rather the trouble, isn't it? You're the first person in 6 years I've trusted not to. She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said, she did you a wrong, leaving you that way. I won't pretend otherwise. But she didn't take anything from you that was worth keeping if it could be lost so easy. A man's whole self oughtn't hang on one person's choosing to stay. That's a hard thing to believe at 3 a.m, standing at an altar. I expect it is. I'm not asking you to have believed it then. I'm asking whether you might start believing it now. He looked at her for a long moment, the lamp throwing soft light across the hard lines of his face, softening them in a way the daylight never did. I think, he said carefully, that you may be the first reason I've had to try. The trouble, when it came from the direction Imogen had least expected. Not from Desmond's guardedness, which had been thawing steadily through the dark months, but from the ranch itself. From the small, closed world of people who watched a man like Desmond Wakefield and had opinions about what he owed his name and his land. His sister Eleanor arrived from Saskatoon in February, ostensibly for a visit, and found her brother laughing, actually laughing, an unfamiliar and startling sound, at something the housekeeper had said while setting the table. Eleanor watched this with the particular sharpness of a woman who has spent 6 years worrying over a brother's solitude and isn't certain whether to be glad of its end or suspicious of its cause. You're fond of her, Eleanor said to him later, when Imogen had gone to bank the fires. She's a good housekeeper, Desmond. Eleanor had known him 31 years. She wasn't fooled. I haven't seen you like this since before Sorcha. I don't say that to wound you. I say it because I want to know if you've let yourself notice it. He didn't answer for a long while, looking at the fire. I notice it every day, he admitted finally, quietly, as though the words cost him something to say even to his own sister. I don't know what to do with it. She's in my employ, Eleanor. There's a wrongness to it, wanting what I want, when she's dependent on this position for her living. I won't put her in a position where she feels obliged to accept a man's regard because her wages hang on it. Then ask her plainly, and make clear she may refuse you with no harm to her place here. Let the choice be hers and hers alone. That seems the honest way through it, and you were always an honest man before. He thought about that for 3 more days before he found the courage, and Imogen, watching him grow quieter and more careful around her through that stretch, mistook it at first for the old closedness returning, and braced herself for the loss of the small warmth they'd built, certain she'd somehow pushed too far, said too much, let herself want too openly something that was never going to be offered. She was wrong, as it turned out, though it took her some days to learn it. He found her in the garden in early March, the first thaw barely begun, the ground still hard at the edges, but soft enough near the kitchen door that she'd started turning it for the spring planting, kneeling in the cold dirt with her sleeves pushed up despite the chill. You'll catch your death, he said, the old worry in his voice gentled now by something else underneath it. I've survived worse than cold dirt, Mr. Wakefield. She sat back on her heels, brushing hair from her face with the back of one gloved hand, leaving a smudge across her temple that he found, against all his old instincts toward restraint, almost unbearably dear. Desmond, he said, I think, after this winter, I think you might call me Desmond then. She said it carefully, testing the shape of it, and something in her chest moved at the sound of it in her own voice. He crouched beside her in the dirt, heedless of his good trousers, which was so unlike the man Otis had described to her in October that she nearly laughed. I haven't the words for this the way I'd like to. I was never a man given to pretty speeches, and 6 years of silence haven't improved my skill at it. So I'll say it plain, the way you'd say a thing to me, and you may do with it what you like. He paused, and she watched him gather himself the way she'd seen him gather himself before a difficult decision about the herd, about the land, the same careful weighing. Except this time the thing being weighed was his own heart, laid out plain between them. I don't want you to leave this place, Imogen. Not as my housekeeper. As my wife, if you'd have me. I know what I'm asking, and I know it's sudden by the calendar, even if it doesn't feel sudden to me living it. I won't think less of you, and you'll keep your place here regardless, if the answer's no. I only needed you to know the truth of it, plainly, the way you've always wanted things said to you. Imogen sat very still in the cold garden, the dirt under her knees, Her husband's face, Thomas's face, gone 11 months now, gentle and tired and gone, rising up in her memory the way it sometimes still did. Unbidden, and she let it rise, and she let it settle, because she had learned this past year that grief and the possibility of happiness were not, in fact, enemies, only two seasons of the same year, each with its place. "I loved my husband," she said quietly. "I won't pretend otherwise to make this easier for either of us. He was a good man, and I miss him still, some days more than others. I wouldn't ask you to pretend it. I know you wouldn't. That's rather why I can say yes." She looked at him, at the hard, handsome face gone soft with hoping, at the man who'd turned away 16 women and built a fortress out of his own loneliness, and let her somehow walk straight through the gate of it without ever quite meaning to try. "Yes, Desmond. I'll have you, and gladly, and I'll not waste either of our time pretending I came here expecting it, because I didn't. But I'm not sorry it found me." He kissed her there in the half-thawed garden, her gloves still full of dirt, her hair coming loose from its pins. And it was not the kiss of two young people with the whole easy run of a life ahead of them. It was something steadier than that. Two people who'd each already buried one kind of future and had decided, against the evidence of their own histories, to risk building another. They married in May, in the small church in town rather than St. Aidan's, with Otis standing up for Desmond and Phoebe, fussing over Imogen's hair, and Eleanor weeping happily in the second pew, and the whole ranch crew turned out in their good clothes looking uncomfortable and pleased. Desmond did not flinch once through the whole ceremony, did not look toward the door the way Imogen had half feared, in some private unspoken corner of her heart, that he might, old wounds, have a way of whispering even at the moment of their healing. He looked only at her the entire time, with an expression Otis later described to Phoebe as a man who'd finally stopped waiting to be left. That night, in the ranch house that had once held 11 silent rooms and now held, slowly, the sound of two people learning each other's quiet, Desmond stood at the bedroom window looking out over land that had felt, for 6 long years, like a kind of penance, and felt it settle into something else instead. Not a fortress any longer, but simply a home, with someone in it who'd chosen to stay. Imogen came and stood beside him, her hand finding his without either of them quite deciding it should, and together they looked out at the dark shapes of the foothills, the same hills that had watched him stand alone at an altar 6 years before, and watched him, now, standing here instead, no longer alone at all. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I spent 6 years certain the worst thing that could happen to a man was being left standing somewhere waiting," Desmond said slowly. "I don't think that anymore. I think the worst thing would have been never opening the gate again. You did that. I want you to know I see it. What it cost you, walking those 4 miles in the rain to a man everyone in town warned you off of, and then having the patience to wait out my foolishness besides." "I didn't think of it as patience," Imogen said. "I thought of it as recognizing something worth the waiting. Thomas used to say a thing's only worth what you're willing to work for, and I believed him then and I believe it now. You were worth it, Desmond. The whole closed-up, careful, grieving shape of you. I'd walk those 4 miles again tomorrow, knowing what I know now." He turned from the window and drew her in, and outside the foothills kept their old silence, but the house no longer held its breath the way it once had. It simply stood, full and warm, and finally, after so long, lived in the way a house is meant to be, with two people inside it who had each, in their own season, stopped being afraid to want something and reach for it anyway.